In the secluded and time-weathered village of Ravensbrook, hidden amidst winding lanes and brooding hills, there stood a dignified old Victorian mansion. This historic dwelling, with walls wrapped in tendrils of ivy and windows that peered out like ancient eyes, was home to the respectable Carter family. The once grand abode, while bearing the marks of time, still retained an air of grace and subtle grandeur, much like a time capsule preserving whispers from a bygone era. Within this venerable house resided William Carter, a stern and scholarly man in his 40s. With a countenance marked by deep-set eyes and a graying beard meticulously groomed to convey dignity, he carried the air of someone accustomed to respect. His wife, Eleanor, was a gentlewoman, her kind demeanor accentuated by her soft curls and warm eyes that always seemed to carry a touch of melancholy. Their 3 children, each remarkably different from the other, completed the family. Lydia, a 17-year-old with her mother's grace, had an inquisitive spirit that found solace in books. Thomas, the 12-year-old, had an adventurous streak, his youthful features often lit up with unrestrained curiosity. And the youngest, 6-year-old Abigail, was a delightful melange of innocence and mischief, her laughter often filling the old halls with vivacity. The quietude of one uneventful evening, with shadows playing hide-and-seek amidst the fading light, was punctuated by the Carter family gathering around the grand oak dining table. The table was set meticulously, and the room was bathed in the warm, flickering light of a chandelier overhead, casting dancing shadows on the walls adorned with portraits of past ancestors. It was amidst this domestic tableau that a rhythmic knock echoed through the silent corridors, like a precursor to a symphony yet to unfold. The sound seemed oddly out of place, almost anachronistic, and it caused William to furrow his brows in slight consternation as he rose from his seat. As he strode towards the door, his steps resonated in the quiet house, harmonizing with the ticking of an antique grandfather clock. Upon opening the heavy oak door, William was greeted by an unusual sight. A stranger stood on the doorstep, his appearance seemingly plucked straight from the 1920s. He was impeccably dressed in a well-tailored suit that exuded a bygone elegance, complete with a perfectly angled bowler hat and a polished cane, which he held with an air of casual aristocracy. His eyes, obscured partially by the brim of his hat, held an inscrutable gleam, and his smile, though polite, didn't quite reach them. The stranger extended a gloved hand towards William, his posture exuding an old-world charm as he introduced himself, with a voice as smooth as velvet. "Good evening, sir. My name is Mr. Sinclair. I find myself in a bit of a predicament and was hoping to seek shelter within your respectable abode for a couple nights," he articulated, his words carefully chosen and imbued with a courteous cadence. Mr. Sinclair's presence was inexplicably unsettling, akin to a chilly draft that sneaks in through a barely perceptible crack in a window. His eyes, partially hidden beneath the shadow of his bowler hat, held an uncanny depth, as if hiding ancient secrets. Yet despite the unease he provoked, his manners were beyond reproach, polished and disarmingly impeccable. The Carters, bound by the principles of hospitality, and perhaps swayed by the stranger's eloquence, albeit with a hint of reluctance, agreed to his request. Eleanor, wearing an expression of concern, thinly veiled by her hospitable smile, instructed the household staff to prepare a room for their unexpected guest. However, as soon as Mr. Sinclair stepped over the threshold, a series of peculiar and inexplicable incidents began to unfold within the walls of the Carter residence. Whispers, hitherto unheard, seemed to echo through the long, dimly lit corridors, as if the house itself had suddenly found a voice. Cold spots lingered in rooms like unseen specters, making the family shudder involuntarily. The Carter children, each in their own way, were especially affected by these bizarre occurrences. Lydia, a perceptive and thoughtful young lady with chestnut hair cascading down her shoulders and eyes that mirrored the depth of her thoughts, increasingly felt an unsettling sensation of being watched. She would often pause, looking over her shoulder, feeling a gaze that seemed almost tangible but seeing no one. Thomas, a curious and adventurous lad with a mop of unruly hair and eyes alight with youthful exuberance, began hearing footsteps echoing behind him when he walked the hallways. He would whirl around, expecting to see a family member, but was always greeted by empty space. His curiosity slowly began to morph into trepidation. The youngest, little Abigail, with her cherubic cheeks and eyes sparkling with untarnished innocence, began speaking to invisible friends. She would be found giggling in corners, conversing animatedly with empty chairs, and often looked past her family members as if focused on someone only she could perceive. The once comforting familiarity of the Carter home seemed to be eroding, giving way to an atmosphere charged with a silent, haunting anticipation. As days turned into nights, the occurrences within the Carter household escalated, but so did the family's financial burdens. William, a stern patriarch known for his unyielding demeanor, found himself confronting debts that loomed like shadows over his family's once prosperous life. Eleanor, a graceful woman with soft, caring eyes and a demeanor that belied an underlying strength, was fraught with worry, her hands wringing anxiously in private moments. The house, once echoing with laughter, now resonated with an unspoken tension that was palpable in the very air. One overcast afternoon, when the room seemed darker and the walls seemed to close in with their financial despair, Mr. Sinclair approached William and Eleanor. He found them in the study, a room adorned with shelves of leather-bound books, the air heavy with the scent of aged wood and lingering pipe smoke. The room, usually a haven for William, now felt like a chamber of unspoken anxieties. With a demeanor as calm as the eye of a storm, Mr. Sinclair began to articulate an offer that seemed like a beacon of hope amidst their turmoil. He produced, seemingly out of nowhere, a small, intricately carved box. The box, no larger than the palm of a hand, was made of a dark polished wood that seemed to absorb the light around it. Ornate silver filigree adorned its edges, and an unadorned silver latch beckoned to be opened. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Mr. Sinclair began, his voice a hypnotic melody that seemed to momentarily lift the weight from their shoulders. "I understand the strain that has been cast upon your esteemed household. I find myself in a position to offer assistance." He cradled the box gently in his hands as though it were a precious relic. "This," he continued, gesturing to the box, "is an heirloom of sorts. It has the potential to bring immense wealth and alleviate your current predicament." His eyes, those inscrutable orbs, seemed to gleam with an inner light as he spoke. However, there was a caveat. Mr. Sinclair explained that the box required something in return, a favor. The nature of this favor remained undisclosed, shrouded in ambiguous phrasing and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Desperation, mingled with a sense of hope, led William and Eleanor to cast aside their reservations. In that moment, the promise of salvation clouded their judgment, and they found themselves nodding in agreement, oblivious to the unspecified terms that hung in the air like a yet undiscovered portent. The box was accepted, the deal struck, and Mr. Sinclair's smile deepened, creating subtle creases on his otherwise impassive face. The room seemed to grow colder, and the Carters were left with the box in their hands, unaware of the consequences that their decision had set into motion. The shift in the atmosphere of the Carter residence was both immediate and disconcerting. Once a sanctuary of warmth and familial love, the venerable Victorian house seemed to undergo a metamorphosis as the night fell. The change was almost palpable, as though the very walls were breathing a different air, one laden with a chilling foreboding. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seemed denser, clinging to the corners of the rooms like spectral entities. The tall, ornate mirrors reflected the dim light in a manner that seemed almost reluctant, as though afraid to reveal what might lurk just out of sight. The polished mahogany furniture, once a testament to the family's refined taste, now appeared somber and ominous under the veil of the pervasive gloom. An eerie silence dominated the household, enveloping it like a suffocating blanket. The usual sounds of life, the children's playful banter, the creaking of the floorboards underfoot, the comforting hum of the hearth, seemed muffled and distant. Each footstep echoed with an uncanny resonance, making the family members tread lightly, as though afraid to disturb something unseen. Rooms that were once filled with joy and laughter now felt oppressive, as if the ceilings had descended a few inches, pressing down on those who dared to enter. The once welcoming living room, adorned with plush sofas and framed family portraits, now seemed to repel any attempt at merriment. Laughter, when it dared to bubble up, died prematurely on the lips, stifled by the unseen weight in the air. Eleanor, a kind and nurturing woman with a gentle demeanor, found herself most attuned to this transformation. Her eyes, usually so warm and inviting, were now clouded with an unexplained dread. Eleanor moved through the rooms with a grace marred by her newfound apprehension. The house, a place she had once navigated with the certainty and familiarity of a haven, now felt like a maze fraught with uncertainties. She felt her heart heavy within her chest, an anchor pulling her down into an ocean of anxiety. Her usual tasks of tending to the children and maintaining the house became ordeals, each moment stretching out before her like an endless expanse. She tried to maintain a facade of normalcy to keep her children from sensing her fear, but the effort was draining. Eleanor's intuition whispered to her, hinting that the changes in her home were tied to the mysterious box and the stranger, Mr. Sinclair. Yet she couldn't fathom how or why. The house had become a stranger, and Eleanor, caught in the tumultuous storm of the unexplained, yearned for the comforting light of understanding. The realization dawned on the Carter family slowly, creeping into their consciousness like a fog that refused to lift. The wealth that had materialized almost magically had brought with it no joy, no sense of relief. Instead, it seemed to exacerbate the unsettling atmosphere that had taken hold of their home. The coins and bills, though gleaming and crisp, felt tainted somehow, as if they were carriers of the same oppressive energy that now pervaded the house. The once beloved home seemed to be under some sort of possession or influence, and each room seemed to harbor an unseen presence. The walls, once filled with memories of laughter and celebrations, now seemed to whisper of secrets and hidden sorrows. Objects would move of their own accord, doors would creak open when no one was near, and chilling drafts would sweep through the rooms even with all the windows firmly shut. Lydia, the eldest of the Carter children, took it upon herself to unravel the mystery that had befallen her family. A thoughtful and intelligent girl with chestnut hair that cascaded down her back in gentle waves, Lydia had always possessed a curious and rational mind. She was a voracious reader, her appetite for knowledge as insatiable as the flames in the hearth. Seeking to make sense of the baffling occurrences, Lydia delved into researching both the enigmatic Mr. Sinclair and the small, ornate box that had promised so much but had delivered only strife. She spent long hours poring over old newspapers, dusty tomes, and ancient records in the village archives. Her fingers danced over the yellowed pages, searching for any trace of the mysterious stranger, or a box that brought wealth at an unspecified cost. By candlelight, she would scrutinize every scrap of information she could find, her green eyes scanning the texts with a fervor born out of desperation. Her room, usually a sanctuary of teenage whimsy with posters adorning the walls and books scattered haphazardly, had transformed into a makeshift study, cluttered with piles of documents and notes. The family watched as Lydia, usually so full of life and vigor, grew more determined yet weary with each passing day. Her pursuit of the truth became an obsession, and she often lost track of time, forgetting meals and forsaking sleep. Her once vibrant eyes now mirrored the exhaustion that gripped her, but they also burned with a relentless determination. Lydia tried to rationalize the occurrences, seeking a logical explanation amidst the chaos. She longed to uncover some hidden truth that would free her family from the eerie grip that had taken hold of their lives. Her quest was not just a search for answers, but a desperate plea for normalcy, a way to restore the laughter and love that had once filled the walls of the Carter household. The days following the acceptance of Mr. Sinclair's peculiar gift were fraught with disturbances that seemed to defy explanation. The Carter household, once a sanctuary of warmth and love, was now ensnared in an atmosphere of perpetual unease. Objects around the house seemed to have taken on a life of their own, creating an unsettling symphony of inexplicable occurrences. In the middle of dinner, silverware would clatter suddenly, propelled by an unseen force. Chairs moved abruptly, causing the family to startle, and picture frames tilted at odd angles on the walls as if subjected to invisible, mischievous hands. Doors slammed shut without warning, and windows rattled violently in their frames, even on still nights. Spectral figures, translucent and ethereal, began to materialize at odd hours, their appearances accompanied by a drop in temperature that sent shivers down the spines of the Carter family. These apparitions were fleeting but left an indelible impression, their ghostly visages forever imprinted in the minds of the observers. Thomas, a normally adventurous and lively boy with a shock of unruly brown hair and an ever-present curiosity in his bright eyes, found himself paralyzed by fear one night. He had always been the one to seek out mysteries and explore every nook and cranny of the old house. However, the sight of a ghostly figure, a woman dressed in a tattered gown that seemed to be from a bygone era, standing at the end of the hallway left him rooted to the spot, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure's eyes, mournful and filled with an ageless sorrow, seemed to bore into Thomas's very soul. The hallway, lit only by the dim glow of a solitary nightlight, seemed to stretch endlessly, and the air grew thick with a chilling silence. Thomas, his adventurous spirit momentarily eclipsed by a primal fear, found himself unable to move, his gaze locked with the spectral figure until it slowly faded into the shadows. Little Abigail, the youngest of the Carter siblings, was affected most of all. With her golden curls and cherubic face, she had always been a beacon of joy in the household. But now, her nights were marred by terror. Abigail's room, once a haven filled with soft toys and the comforting scent of lavender, had transformed into a place of nightmares. Every night she would cry, her small body trembling as she clung to her blanket. The dark corners of her room, where her stuffed animals once sat in a protective huddle, seemed to whisper menacingly. Shadows morphed into sinister shapes, twisting and undulating in the faint moonlight that filtered through her curtains. Her once comforting toys now cast grotesque shadows that seemed to come alive in the darkness, their whispered conversations just beyond the realm of understanding, but filled with an inexplicable menace. Eleanor would rush to her side, her heart aching at the sight of her terrified daughter. She would cradle Abigail, soothing her with lullabies and gentle caresses, trying to dispel the night terrors that gripped the child. But the room remained oppressive, the darkness clinging stubbornly, and the whispers persisting in their haunting refrain. The Carter family, once so harmonious and joyous, now found themselves ensnared in a web of fear and uncertainty, each strange occurrence further fraying the bonds that held them together. Desperation, like an insidious fog, descended upon the Carter household. Eleanor and William, once steadfast and composed, now found themselves grappling with the realization that they had unwittingly struck a Faustian bargain. The pact they had made with the enigmatic Mr. Sinclair had cast a shadow over their once tranquil existence, and every moment within the walls of their home served as a chilling reminder of their ill-fated decision. Eleanor, with her soft hazel eyes now clouded with worry, moved through the rooms with a frantic energy. Her once meticulous and calm demeanor had been replaced by an urgency that bordered on panic. William, his sturdy frame and stern face that once radiated authority, now seemed haggard and drawn. His graying beard, once a mark of his dignified maturity, now seemed to accentuate the deep lines etched by worry on his face. Together they scoured ancient tomes and obscure texts, searching desperately for any hint of a solution. Their once cozy living room, adorned with family photographs and mementos of happy vacations, was now cluttered with dusty books, handwritten notes, and flickering candles that cast an eerie glow on their frantic faces. The once familiar sound of laughter and lively chatter was replaced by the rustling of pages and the desperate murmurings of two parents searching for a way to protect their family. The house, which had stood for generations as a silent witness to countless memories, seemed to have turned against them. The once comforting creaks of the old wooden floorboards now seemed ominous, almost mocking. The walls, adorned with elegant wallpaper that had once been chosen with such care, seemed to echo with sinister laughter, a cacophony that only heightened the sense of impending doom. Every attempt the Carters made to reverse the consequences of their pact was met with resistance. Rituals meant to cleanse were inexplicably disrupted, protective charms were found shattered, and pleas for help from friends and experts were met with inexplicable obstacles. The house seemed to be an entity unto itself, mocking their futile attempts to regain their former peace. William and Eleanor spent sleepless nights huddled together, poring over ancient manuscripts and muttering incantations that they hoped would be their salvation. Their hands, once steady, shook as they mixed concoctions and set protective circles, their voices quivering with a mix of hope and fear. Desperation gripped them like a vice, each passing day a torturous reminder of the deal they had so naively struck. The once harmonious rhythm of their lives had been disrupted, replaced by a chaotic symphony of fear and urgency. In the midst of this maelstrom, the Carters clung to each other, their determination fueled by the love they had for their children, and the desperate need to restore their home to its former sanctity. Lydia, with an innate sense of curiosity and a determination that belied her age, dedicated herself to unraveling the mystery surrounding Mr. Sinclair and the insidious box that had brought such turmoil into their lives. Her room, once a haven adorned with posters of bands and adorned with soft fairy lights, had transformed into a makeshift study, cluttered with newspapers, obscure texts, and hastily scribbled notes. Her chestnut hair, usually loosely tied in a carefree ponytail, now hung disheveled around her shoulders as she hunched over her desk, poring through old news articles and digital archives late into the night. Her vibrant eyes, once filled with the carefree joy of youth, were now hardened with a resolve and determination that came from the grim understanding of the threat they faced. Through her relentless search, Lydia began to piece together a pattern that sent chills down her spine. Her research revealed accounts separated by decades, sometimes even centuries, all bearing an eerie similarity to their own predicament. Families, just like hers, had encountered a suave stranger, clad in styles reminiscent of the 1920s, introducing himself as Mr. Sinclair. In each tale, the stranger offered a box that promised solutions to their problems, but ultimately led to their doom. Lydia uncovered stories of households driven to madness, once happy homes turned into sites of inexplicable phenomena, and families torn apart by fear. Her hands trembled as she read through handwritten journals and digital posts, all describing hauntingly similar occurrences. Shadows that whispered, chilling cold spots, and spectral figures that thrived on fear. As she delved deeper, Lydia came across an ancient tome in the local library that seemed to hold more answers. The pages, yellowed with age and brittle to touch, spoke of an entity that existed between realms, feeding off the fear and despair of the living. This sinister being had the ability to bind itself to objects, creating cursed conduits through which it could channel its malevolence. The box, it seemed, was one such object, and Mr. Sinclair was the entity's eternal emissary. Lydia's heart raced as she read accounts of families who had, just like the Carters, been beguiled into accepting the cursed box. The stories spoke of an eternal torment, a cycle of fear that fed the entity and bound the families to a never-ending nightmare. The tales were grim, filled with despair and warnings to future generations. In her room, amidst the dim glow of her desk lamp, Lydia felt a chill run through her. The realization dawned upon her that Mr. Sinclair was not just a man, but an ageless entity that fed off fear and despair, weaving a web of cursed deals to trap the unsuspecting. With trepidation, Lydia understood that her family was ensnared in a sinister trap that had been laid countless times before. Armed with this knowledge, she knew that she had to act, to find a way to break the cycle and free her family from the insidious grip of Mr. Sinclair and the cursed box. In the dimly lit living room of the Carter family home, an atmosphere of resolve mingled with trepidation. The space, once filled with warmth and echoes of laughter, now seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. The antique furniture, passed down through generations, appeared to sag, burdened by the eerie occurrences that had plagued the household. The wallpaper, once a cheerful floral pattern, now seemed to twist and contort into menacing shapes in the flickering candlelight. William and Eleanor Carter, standing side by side, emanated a unified front despite the fear that gnawed at them. William, his usually neat beard now slightly unkempt, and his eyes reflecting a determined fire, clenched his fists at his side. Eleanor, her gentle eyes now hard with maternal protectiveness, stood with her shoulders squared, ready to shield her children from whatever darkness was to come. Lydia, Thomas, and Abigail huddled together, their young faces reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. Lydia's chestnut hair was pulled back tightly, her eyes scanning the room alertly, while Thomas, his boyish curiosity now overshadowed by the seriousness of the moment, clung to her side. Little Abigail, her innocence incongruent with the grim atmosphere, clutched her older sibling's hands. The clock struck midnight, and the house seemed to hold its breath. The very air was heavy with anticipation, and shadows clung to the corners like malicious specters. It was then that Mr. Sinclair stepped forth, materializing as if woven from the darkness itself. His suit, reminiscent of the roaring 20s, was impeccably tailored, and his bowler hat sat at a jaunty angle atop his head. His cane, adorned with a silver handle, tapped rhythmically against the hardwood floor. With a sinister grace, he surveyed the room, his eyes glinting with malevolent amusement. His lips, curled into a smirk, seemed to mock the very desperation that clung to the air. The Carters, fortified by their unity and newfound knowledge, faced him head-on. William, his voice steady yet tinged with rage, demanded, "We want an end to this haunting, Sinclair. We demand that you release us from this pact." The house, as if reacting to his words, shuddered and groaned, its very foundations trembling as if alive. The air crackled with an energy that was almost tangible, and the temperature dropped precipitously, causing visible breaths to form amidst tense silence. Mr. Sinclair, unperturbed, leisurely paced the room, his cane tapping melodically against the floor. His smirk widened as he spoke, his voice a smooth cadence that held an underlying menace. "Ah, the Carters," he mused, his gaze sweeping across the family. "How touching, but I'm afraid you misunderstand the nature of our agreement. The pact you've entered, you see, is irreversible." His words hung in the air like a death knell, and the room seemed to close in, as though the house itself were complicit in their despair. The once familiar surroundings now seemed alien, transformed into a nightmarish stage where the Carter family's fate hung precariously in the balance. In the oppressive atmosphere of the living room, the Carters stood defiant, their faces resolute and their postures emanating a collective strength that seemed to permeate the space around them. William, his dignified beard now seeming more like a warrior's battle scars, stepped forward, his eyes ablaze with a fierce determination. Eleanor, her graceful features hardened by the ordeal, stood steadfast beside him, her resolve emanating like a protective shield around her children. Lydia, with her intelligent eyes ablaze, had transformed from a thoughtful teenager into a young woman of conviction. Thomas, though young, displayed a bravery beyond his years, and little Abigail, her innocence giving way to a steely resolve, clung tightly to her family. Together, they faced Mr. Sinclair, an unwavering phalanx of unity and love. It became evident that their bond, the very thing that Mr. Sinclair had sought to exploit, had morphed into an indomitable force. The realization dawned upon them that fear was the fuel that had empowered this malevolent entity. Determinedly, William stepped forward, his voice echoing through the room like a clarion call. "We are not afraid of you, Sinclair. You have no power here. Leave our home, now." As these words resounded through the once welcoming space, it was as if the very air began to change. The suffocating oppression began to lift, and the shadows that clung to the corners seemed to recede. The Carters, standing united, felt an energy surging through them, their collective resolve weakening the sinister presence before them. Mr. Sinclair, who had once exuded an aura of control and malevolence, now seemed to waver. His once impeccable suit appeared to lose its luster, and his confident demeanor gave way to a flicker of uncertainty. The realization that fear, his lifeblood, was being drained away seemed to physically diminish him. With a final determined push, the Carters, their voices united, forcefully commanded him to leave. The house seemed to rally with them, its very walls seeming to expel the unwelcome entity. And just like that, Mr. Sinclair was ejected from the premises, his form dissipating into the night like a nightmare upon waking. The haunting ceased abruptly. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Yet the experience had left an indelible mark on the Carter family. They were forever changed, having peered into an abyss and emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. The house, with its ivy-clad facade and time-worn charm, returned to its former state, yet there was an undeniable shift. The Carters could still sense a residual chill in the air, an almost imperceptible whisper from the past that served as a reminder of the stranger who had once crossed their threshold and the darkness he had ushered in.